So we have with us today the author of the first biography of Belva Lockwood, Jill Norgren from City University of New York. We have with us Judge John Ferren, who I am delighted to welcome back to the Center, who was a former fellow at the Center and himself the author of an outstanding judicial biography. We hope we will have with us Wendy Williams from Georgetown Law Center, who may be stuck in traffic somewhere, and I'm not going to tell you about all of these people because you've got some information about them in front of you and you don't need me to take up that time. And most importantly, we have with us today someone else who was never elected to public office but has had an enormous impact on public policy in the United States. And as I said, the last time that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was at the Center, I think all of us who are at the Center, particularly those of us who are women, and most certainly myself included, feel rather strongly that we would not be here had Justice Ginsburg not led the way and made so many things possible for us that would otherwise not have been possible for women in the United States. Justice Ginsburg very kindly wrote an introduction to this biography, and so it is appropriate that she is going to start off today's program. Justice Ginsburg?
When Jill Norgren sent me her manuscript and asked if I would write a foreword, we were just gearing up for the new term, and it was not a time when I welcomed additional extracurricular assignments. But after sampling several parts of the manuscript, I just said yes. Jill's book tells the story of a woman who would not be put down. The book paints a vivid portrait of Belva Lockwood and should gain for her life the public attention long overdue. Jill's was a prodigious effort. Women in the public eye nowadays are courted by various archives seeking to be the repository of their papers. Not so in Lockwood's time. Piecing together her work and days required the relentless pursuit of a determined sleuth, and that's just what Jill became in this process, a most persistent detective. In the introduction to the biography, I noted that Elizabeth Cady Stanton had compared Lockwood to Shakespeare's Portia. And Lockwood does resemble the Shakespeare character in this respect. They were both individuals of impressive intellect who demonstrated that women can hold their own as advocates for justice. Like Shakespeare's Portia, Lockwood used wit, ingenuity, and sheer force of will to unsettle society's conceptions of her sex. But Portia, to accomplish her mission, had to impersonate a man. Lockwood, in contrast, used no disguise in tackling the prevailing notions that women and lawyering, no less politics, do not mix. Not only did she become the first woman admitted to the bar of the Supreme Court and the first woman to argue before the court, but she ran twice full campaigns for the office of President of the United States. Her front-runner status was achieved by unflagging effort. In 1869, then the mother of two and approaching her 39th birthday, she embarked on her lifelong ambition to become a lawyer. Her efforts to gain admission to D.C. area law schools were at first unsuccessful. She was initially rejected on a most familiar ground. Her presence would be likely to distract the attention of the young men. Well, she persevered until National University Law School, now GW Law School, allowed her to matriculate. She encountered yet another obstacle when the school refused to issue her the diploma that she had earned. Men in the class were again the asserted obstacle. Women were not created for the practice of law, it was widely believed, and graduating with women would lessen the value of men's diplomas. Harvard Law School gave similar reasons for excluding women until 1950. Ultimately, Lockwood wrote to President Grant, who was the titular head of the university. She wasted no words. I have passed through the curriculum of study and demand my diploma. Grant didn't answer, but 2 weeks later, in September 1973, the university chancellor awarded Lockwood her diploma. She practiced in the District of Columbia for 3 years, handling all manner of cases, and in 1876 she qualified for and sought admission to the bar of the United States Supreme Court. Chief Justice Morrison Waite reported the denial of her application. The explanation: by the uniform practice of the court and by the fair construction of its rules, none but men are permitted to appear before it as attorneys and counselors. It was not known at the time when the Chief Justice made that report that the tally was 6-3 and that the Chief Justice, in fact, was one of the 3 votes for Lockwood's admission. Undaunted, she lobbied Congress to grant her plea, and she succeeded in February 1879. Congress decreed that any woman possessing the necessary qualifications shall, on motion, be admitted to practice before the Supreme Court of the United States. Lockwood's case is an example that I often give, that sometimes the legislature is more in tune with the winds of change than the court is. Some 21 months after she gained admission, Lockwood became the first woman to participate in oral argument at the court. She next and last argued before the court in 1906, then age 75, with 3 decades of experience as a claims attorney. She helped to secure a multi-million-dollar award for the Cherokees, who had suffered removal from their ancestral lands and relocation without compensation. Lockwood was not content to rest on her personal achievements. She sought not only the suffrage for women, but full political and civil rights. Though she couldn't vote for president, she ran for that office the full course in both 1884 and 1888, pointing out that nothing in the Constitution barred women from becoming president. She wrote in a letter to her future running mate, Marietta Stowe, "We shall never have equal rights until we take them, nor respect until we command it." That same determination characterizes the first woman to serve as a justice of the court, my dear and very much missed colleague, Sandra Day O'Connor. In Sandra's words, "For both men and women, the first step in getting power is to become visible to others, and then to put on an impressive show. As women achieve power, the barriers will fall. As society sees what women can do, as women see what women can do, there will be more women out there doing things, and we'll all be better off for it. So much has changed for the better since Belva Lockwood's years. Admission ceremonies at the court nowadays include women in numbers, and it is no longer unusual for women to represent both sides in the cases we hear. Women today serve as presidents of bar associations, federal judges, state court judges, elected representatives at every level, local, state, and federal. Still, the presence of only one woman on the current High Court indicates the need for women of Lockwood's sense and steel to see the changes she helped to inaugurate through to full fruition. I'm very glad to be here at the announcement of the publication of this book, and I know that all of you have the same treat in store that I had when I read the manuscript. Thank you.
Justice Ginsburg has to get back for an event at the court, but we are so grateful to her that she was able to be here with us even briefly. I will mention that she picked up on the absence of archives back then having to do with women, and one of the things that perhaps will rectify that situation even more than it's already being rectified for current women is the creation of a National Women's History Museum. I want to thank the National Women's History Museum and Susan Jolie, the president of it, who is here, for co-sponsoring this event. And I want to thank also two other co-sponsors, the National Women's Law Center and the George Washington University Women's Studies Program. Just the fact that we have all of those co-sponsors to thank is quite indicative of how far we have come from the time of Belva Lockwood. And with that, let me turn the microphone over to Jill Norgren.
It's a pleasure to be here. Tell me if the mic's picking up. And a pleasure to thank Justice Ginsburg for the wonderful foreword that she contributed to this book. It's a pleasure also to thank Dr. Strum, Susan Nugent, Acacia Reed of the Division of U.S. Studies for organizing this discussion, to thank the staff of the Wilson Center Library and my former Wilson Center interns, now spread around the world. I heard from only one of them 2 weeks ago who's in Beijing, who had seen an advertisement for the book and emailed to me. What a small world we live in. I want to thank these interns in particular for the help they gave me during what was a wonderful year of fellowship residence here at the center. It's a pleasure to acknowledge the many people at the National Archives, the Library of Congress, and the National Museum of American History who helped me to find the 19th century materials without which I could not have written this biography. I'm delighted in particular to say how grateful I am to Robert Ellis Jr. of the National Archives, a long-term supporter of this project. There would be no book without a publisher. The editors and the staff of the New York University Press stepped forward to publish this biography, and they have been a joy to work with. Finally, I want to thank a 10-year-old girl at PS 333 in New York City, my granddaughter Elena Rohner, who gave me my first tutorial in PowerPoint. Let's now turn to the life of Belva Lockwood, born Belva Bennett in northern New York. In the winter of 1866, only months after the end of the Civil War, Belva Lockwood, then McNall, a 35-year-old widowed schoolteacher, arrived in what was a very unformed Washington, D.C., a rather rural and dusty place still, from upstate New York. Hers was a journey of reinvention. Her early life was conventional, but she harbored unconventional dreams. She had married because her family thought it foolish and inappropriate for a girl to continue on in school. However, the tragedy of becoming a widow at the age of 22 dramatically altered her life. 3 years after Uriah McNall's death, she left her 5-year-old daughter, Laura, with her mother and became one of the first women students at Genesee College, a Methodist school south of Rochester, New York. After a decade of teaching in New York State, Lockwood made the decision to move to Washington. She dreamed of a life in politics or in law, despite certain stark realities that women were not permitted to vote or serve on juries, and that no woman at that time had been admitted to a law school. The capital was a hotbed of reform activity when she arrived, and she was soon helping to organize a local women's suffrage association and later to lobby Congress for legislation that would guarantee equal pay to women government employees. She remarried in 1868 only to find her marital status to Ezekiel Lockwood a source of discrimination after she had successfully navigated law school and sought admission to the D.C. bar. Let's pick up the story in 1873, keeping in mind the several themes of her life: ambition, free speech, and the ideal of equality. With this discussion, I hope to provoke your interest in this extraordinary woman. Her story goes beyond Stanton and Anthony, beyond Carnegie, Cleveland, and the male political establishment, and demonstrates how our 19th century history can be expanded. 1873 was a critical year for Lockwood. She had fought her way into law school and successfully completed the course of study, only, as Justice Ginsburg mentioned, to be told that because she was a woman, the faculty would not grant her diploma, thus withholding from her the professional privilege of becoming a member of the District of Columbia Bar. She struggled to overcome this discrimination with patience, negotiation, and by sitting through oral examinations not required of the male candidates. When all of this failed, Lockwood, determined to establish her own law practice, made one last desperate appeal, the one that Justice Ginsburg mentioned, to the President of the United States, who happened to also be the president ex officio of her law school. She sent 2 letters. The first was long and polite, detailing her efforts as a law student. The second, as the Justice mentioned, was brusque and demanding. And you can just see here a repeat that she says to him, in effect, do you have the authority here? Are you the head of this? And if so, and she ends this letter, I am entitled to and I demand my diploma. She did indeed receive the diploma 2 weeks later, and days after that was admitted to the D.C. bar. This permitted her then to set up the larger legal practice that she had intended. Her practice took advantage of the Washington, D.C. location. She specialized in claims against the government, patent claims, veterans benefits, divorces, a whole range of issues. It was a solo practice aided by her daughter, Laura, who by then was in her early 20s. Her clients were working-class people in the main, laborers, painters, tradesmen, veterans, small property owners, and a few women in distress. She had several notable cases. One, she defended in criminal court a woman charged with infanticide. In several other cases, in civil court, she helped women who wished to bring damages claims against men they said had seduced them, or for breach of marriage contract, which was a big thing in the 19th century. Lockwood saw her male law colleagues riding around on bicycles. She saw that it was an effective mode of transportation, that they were getting more work done more quickly. And so, although no woman engaged in bicycle riding, which was considered completely immodest, She went out and researched it, bought herself this adult tricycle, and was seen on the streets of the district riding it with her bag of briefs for the court. Her practice permitted her sufficient success that by 1877 she was able to declare a certain middle-class professional status by purchasing a home on F Street near the MCI. Is it still called the MCI Center? It was not grand. It was a mortgaged row house in the middle of a commercial district. It was her home, her office, a boarding house, and a long-term investment, which she would variously use as equity against loans. Here, somewhat later than the year in which she bought it, you see F Street, a busy commercial street. I don't know if you can read it, but on the tall building there, you can see it's called the Barrister Building. F Street was the center of law practices and also the site of the office that published one of the law reporters here in the district. It was a boarding house. Washington has a long tradition of boarding houses, of providing for people who are transients, right? And here is a photograph that appeared in the New York Times in January of California Representative George Miller with the gentleman from Congress who boarded with him. So Lockwood did something which is in the fine tradition of the Hill. How do we look at her in the late 1870s? She is conventional, a wife, a mother, a homeowner, a regular churchgoer. She is at the same time radical and independent. She has joined and is very active in the leadership of the National Woman Suffrage Association, which is the Stanton and Anthony faction of the movement. She has joined the most radical peace group in the United States, the Philadelphia-based Universal Peace Union, a group which I think in today's language we would call a human rights organization, a group very, very committed to issues of social justice. Within the women's movement, she fights very hard for the rights of Mormon women. This was something that divided the women's movement at the time, and she never stepped back from her support. And then she cast herself into a 5-year battle that Justice Ginsburg referred to that begins in 1874. She was denied admission to a federal court, to the U.S. Court of Claims, where she wished to represent a client. They turned her back for several reasons and suggested that if she was not happy with their decision, that she should go to the Supreme Court. She decided instead, being someone who at this point was very comfortable lobbying Congress, she had come to Washington and she observed and taught herself the arts of lobbying. She went to Congress. She enlisted then Representative Benjamin Butler, well known from the Civil War, to introduce legislation in the House. She found a supporter in the Senate. But it was just ahead of its time. And while it did fairly well in the House, it was killed in committee in the Senate. She then thought that she might try to have a member of the Washington community move her admission at the U.S. Supreme Court. But she knew that the rules of the High Court demanded that any candidate have practiced for 3 years. So she, at this point, had to wait. And when she had been a member of the D.C. Bar for 3 years, she went to Albert Gallatin Riddle, an attorney here in the district who had come as a congressman from Ohio and stayed on as an attorney and district attorney. Riddle was very involved in reform movements and particularly committed to women's suffrage and women's rights. And he moved her admission. As Justice Ginsburg said, when the court voted on the issue, they were split, and with 6 votes against her, she found herself again turned back. The court sent her back to Congress, of course, knowing that she had not succeeded at Congress the first time, so they were doing her no favor sending her back there. She said when she went back to Congress that nothing was too daring to attempt. She had nothing to lose. She, at this point, had lost before 2 of the branches of the government. But again, she was able to find male allies, and again, a bill that would prevent such discrimination was introduced. She was asked to testify, and her testimony gives us some indication of why she was so committed to this. This was not some abstract legal question for her of women's rights. This was very concrete. Remember, she had spent many years as a single mother. By this time, her second husband actually is months from dying in January of '77. And for her, economic independence, the economic independence of women as they're connected to economic rights were critical. She understood just how women would be held back until they had that kind of economic independence and security. The House approves the bill, and that leaves her understanding that she's now facing again the more conservative Senate. And again, as the first time, the very powerful Senator Roscoe Conklin tables the bill. Her allies, again, we see this dance between supporters and opponents. Her allies revive it in committee, but then it receives 2 adverse reports. It looks very grim. And then Aaron Sargent, a senator from California, just walks in and does really amazing things with her and for her. He forces a test vote before summer recess. They lose, but it suggests, I think, to the Senate that they're a force to be contended with, and that in the fall they better expect to face this issue again. Lockwood comes back from the Washington summer doldrums, cultivating the press. She had an intuitive feel for how to work with the press and counted many reporters and editors among her friends. She initiated a petition drive which resulted in 160 male attorneys here in the district saying, we have no problem with women attorneys. You guys up there in the Senate, you vote this bill. She did the same thing among New York attorneys. She was all over the place lobbying. And Sargent, at a particularly important moment when they know one of their opponents is going to be out of town, pulls it all together for a floor vote. And he says, referring to women attorneys in this very moving speech, it is oppression to hedge you out by law from profitable employments and monopolize them for ourselves. They succeed in the Senate. They already have their positive vote in the House. The bill goes to President Hayes, and we have then one of the very first federal measures in support of women's rights. The court has to reconvene. It's in recess. It does so on the 3rd, and Lockwood, we can only imagine, makes the most triumphal of appearances. She takes the oath, she kisses the Bible, and she becomes the first woman member of the Supreme Court bar. The crusade opens the whole federal bar to women attorneys. We want a little bit of a sense of what the scene looked like. There are no photographs in papers, remember, at this time. This is a photograph that the court very nicely provided to us today, taken a little bit later, but it gives us a sense. And here we have an illustration from a very well-known journal of the moment, taken, drawn a year later, but again it gives us an idea of the space. And this particular illustration is Belva Lockwood on your left, moving the admission of African-American attorney Samuel Lowry. And what I always find very moving when I look at this is how she seems the outsider. I don't know whether that's just my construction on it. Here you have the certificate that was issued to her, and here some of the language, since the certificate's difficult to read, but indicating that the motion was made by Riddle and that she is now duly admitted and qualified as an attorney and counselor of the Supreme Court. After such a personal and legislative triumph, where did she go? You know, many of us would hold court with the reporters, and that would be that. As I said, this is a story about ambition, as well as commitment to ideals, and so Lockwood looked to a larger stage. And the stage that she found a few years after this was that of U.S. national politics, and specifically the presidential campaign of 1884, which pitted in the main Grover Cleveland against James Blaine. Here we have Cleveland, but here we have the postal stamp issued in 1986 in the Great American series, just to give you an idea of, right? And so I'm interested in asking, why did she run? Ego, clearly, she was a woman of great ego. She was restless. She had a sense of humor. I think she clearly found it interesting and sort of funny that she and all of the women she knew couldn't vote, and yet there was nothing that prohibited them from running for the highest office in the land. But also, she had been one of the women's suffrage leaders who had gone to the Republican Party convention earlier that summer. They were trying to interest the leadership of the party in putting women's suffrage on the platform, and they were rebuffed. The men didn't have the gumption, or they were concerned with the politics of letting women into voting status. And so that also, I think, left the women trying to figure out what their next act would be. And Marietta Stowe, who was a California publisher and editor, had a message for women at least since 1880. Run for office. It will empower you and it will educate you in politics so that when we get the vote, we'll know what to do. Lockwood accepted the nomination of Stowe's Equal Rights Party, which was really a non-party, it was in name only, to be its candidate. I think Stowe and her friends probably saw it all as a joke, but Lockwood took the nomination and ran with it, deciding to make a national campaign. She began with rallies outside of D.C., out in Maryland. Then she held a second rally in her home on F Street. Without a real party and without a treasury, she had to come up with a way of funding a national campaign, and she did that with a very nice business model. She offered herself as a public lecturer. She then appeared at churches, civic halls, and county fairs. This is her campaign portrait and also the cover of the book. Again, because there's no photography in newspapers, we're very limited in sort of our window onto the campaign. And one of the ways then of seeing the campaign, although I will be the first to tell you it's one that very much skews our vision, are cartoons. Lockwood was one of the several third-party candidates, and the third-party candidates, along with the two male candidates, were very much taken up by cartoonists. This appeared in the important publication Puck 2 weeks after she accepted the nomination. The caption, I know they're hard to read, says, "Now let the show go on," and it shows Lockwood with Benjamin Butler, who was running on another third-party ticket. A few weeks later, Judge Magazine came up with a more biting cartoon, more biting because, for example, Lockwood is more scantily dressed. She is more caricatured in this. She is surrounded by Anthony and Stanton. On the right are other third-party candidates. What the cartoonist misses in this is that Lockwood did not have the full support of the women's suffrage movement, and Anthony really stood on the sidelines, but the cartoonist didn't know that. They stood on the sidelines because there was still a hope of working with the major parties, and also they were concerned that a woman candidate would be ridiculed and that would undercut the campaign for women's suffrage. Here, towards the end of the campaign in Life magazine, we see a cartoon that works off the myth of Atalanta. And then we come to Election Day. This is before the Australian ballot, where everything is printed on one page. Every party issues its own ballot. And here we have one from that would have been used in New York State. To show the amount of interest in the campaign, I was quite surprised to find this. At Christmas time, 1884, there were still cartoons that were taking up the campaign and Lockwood's involvement in it. Again, Lockwood and Ben Butler. Well, had she won, which of course she did not, U.S. political history would have looked quite different. This is a rundown that appeared in the New York Times earlier this winter. So what do we make of this experiment in democracy? a very small vote, about 5,000, but an enormous civics lesson. A demonstration that a woman could be a candidate, a woman emerges as a role model, that women candidates could and should be taken seriously by the public and the media, and the fact that the nation moved a step closer to understanding that a vibrant democracy cannot be an exclusive men's club. Again, there is the question of life after such an enormous event. And again, Lockwood refused to step back. She used her public notice to become a paid lecturer, which is, of course, before radio, television, and the internet, was a major form both of entertainment and education. And you found at this time Mark Twain, Francis Willard, many very well-known people earning money and spreading their message on the lecture circuit. She continued her practice. She attempted some entrepreneurial activities. She even attempted a second candidacy. She increased her involvement with the peace movement, being really decades ahead of most Americans in her advocacy of arbitration as a method of conflict resolution and international courts. And at the very end of her life became Attorney General for a very interesting group that we can't talk about today, but I urge you to read about in the book, the American Women's Republic, which is a kind of precursor of the League of Women Voters, interested in training women and educating women in politics. Just to give you an idea as we close, this is one of the ads when she was on the lecture circuit, which she did for about 8 years. Quite elaborate handbills. Another which listed some of her dozen lecture topics. And then on the business side of things, she, like, for example, Clara Barton, and like figures today, offered herself as someone who would endorse commercial products. The one that she testified about was this blood and nerve remedy, and that amused me because she was a member of the temperance movement. And these blood and nerve remedies, could have 25% alcohol. She also attempted to capitalize a homeopathic remedies business. I have no evidence that she got it off the ground. And either with or without her knowledge, she was used, again, in sort of the precursor of baseball cards. These are tobacco cards, if any of you collectors. You probably know a great deal about them. This one was just auctioned off about 3 weeks ago in Texas. I hadn't seen it before that. And then, as Justice Ginsburg said, she brings her legal career nearly to a close, although she actually appears in a rather interesting case involving a woman committed to St. Elizabeth's after this. But she wins for her clients, a faction of the Eastern Cherokee, a share of a $5 million judgment before the Supreme Court in 1906. This is a case that began 30 years before. So if we sort of prorated what she received here, it would be small dollars. She was 75 at the time. On her, I think this was actually on her birthday when she was 84, a newspaper editor from upstate New York asked her about women in politics. And she talked about women in the House and the Senate. Remember, Jeanette Rankin becomes the first woman there in 1916. And addressing the question of a woman as president, she says that it will happen if a woman demonstrates that she is fitted to be president. It will be entirely on her own merits, however. No movement can place her there simply because she is probably a woman. We lost that little bit there. I'm always moved when I look at this signature card of Lockwood's that is in my possession, because I think she was never able to sign this signature to a ballot, to a voter registration form of any kind, despite the fact that her country did not permit her and other women in the Maine to vote. Of course, because of federalism, women were voting by this time in some states. She continued to pursue her commitment to women's rights throughout her long life. She never let a bitterness about these issues get to her. She educated herself, as we saw. She became a professional and a role model as a middle-class professional woman. She achieved economic independence, though she was never wealthy, and in the process opened the federal bar to women, ran for the presidency, campaigned for peace in international courts. She proved, I think, what a woman could become. Her accomplishments begin a story of triumph that's still in the telling, and let me end then with the firsts in the story in the telling. Jeanette Rankin comes into the House in 1916. A woman doesn't actually win election to the Senate until 1932. There were some appointments to fill out the terms of dead husbands that came before that. We don't see the nomination and confirmation of a woman to the Supreme Court until 1981, and then only followed by Justice Ginsburg in 1993. And of course, we're still waiting with respect to the issue of a woman in the White House. Joe Freeman, who's here today, a scholar and writer, has been, you have a book that's going to come out on this, correct?
Well, sure, it's a chapter.
Okay. Has sent out information to those of us who are interested that between 1964 and 2004, over 50 women were on at least one ballot as candidates for president, both as minor party candidates and candidates in primary. So slowly there's an accretion, but certainly on that score at least, we haven't gotten there yet. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Next, we're going to hear from Professor Wendy Williams.
Hi. My first question is, but we'll get to the questions later. You call this book The Woman Who Would Be President, and I want to call this book, and you'll see how I pick up these themes, First Lady Lawyer, or Washington's First Lady Lawyer. I found this book on Belva Lockwood extremely exciting, and it set off all kinds of thoughts and connections in my own mind, and I want to touch upon just a few of those. By the end of maybe 3/4 of the way through the book, a whole new sort of layer of my understanding of women's active entry into the profession of law and what they did with it was coming home to me. And also, because of the time period in which this happened, with the constitutional amendments being added to the Constitution, guaranteeing first equality and then the right of African American men to vote, it was a constitutional, it was not just that these women lawyers became lawyers, it was because they then used their legal skills to contribute both to the law of the land and to the constitutional struggles that were beginning then and weren't culminated for women until we finally got Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the court and Sandra Day O'Connor, and the 1970s litigation had worked its way through the courts. It's not just that that Belva Lockwood is a remarkable foremother here, I think. My excitement wasn't because of that exactly. It wasn't, although she is extraordinary, and it wasn't really because I lack familiarity with the sort of broad outlines and maybe even some of the important details of this historical time period and what women were up to on their own behalf to make themselves full citizens of the country. And indeed, I've been teaching a course on this for years at Georgetown. The thing I love, Jill, is that you put her in her historical context in such a encompassing and careful and satisfying way. I love the way you told this story. You take an extraordinary woman and you put her in her social, professional, family, and political context in a way that connects her to the other important things that are going on in her time period, and shows both how she absorbed some of the possibilities of what was going on and contributed to the ongoing unfolding. The first part's sort of the easy part. The woman you convey here, giving the list of the things she did. Extraordinary. And on that level, it's sort of a story like Going Where No Woman Has Gone Before, you know, the sort of independent heroine of an important story. And she was a great person, and she did great things. But at the same time, I appreciated you taking this very winning story about this young woman who managed to overcome all these obstacles and do great things. You took that and you qualified that story, and you expanded that story in ways I want to comment on. You qualified it in the sense that you didn't make her out to be a perfect person. You allowed us how her ambitions sometimes affected her judgment. You observed that sometimes she didn't fully, in expecting that women should work like men, she didn't fully credit the support system that she had in place, which was making possible what she was doing. A support system that included, for a period of time, a husband who was behind her and helped set up the situation in which they could earn money. A daughter, a remarkable daughter, who sort of hung out in the background somewhere and took care of the law office routines, and also, in a way, tried to blow her mother's horn and explain her mother to the public through her articles. You talk about not just how this family operated to support her, but how she came into Washington just at the right moment. She came into Washington at a time when equality was in the air. The great questions of constitutional equality were actually on the table and being debated. And what she did was she managed to surround herself with both religious people whose convictions were consistent with some of these new ideas, and with other leading and very independent women who could also provide her support and inspiration. So even though her personal papers got destroyed, you managed to portray her as a whole person, and I found a great deal to appreciate in that. The other thing, I guess I would say is this is not just a simple story of this is a woman with great determination and she moved mountains. This is a story about, as I mentioned before, a person who found herself, to a large degree, in the right place at the right time with the right support system. Something I don't think she herself fully appreciated, but which comes through in the book. I know there are some high school students around here somewhere, maybe not in this room, but in the next room. And I want to say to them that history is a kind of funny thing. Sometimes we think of it just in terms of the great and famous people and what they do. And she was a great and famous person who disappeared after her period and was rescued finally by Jill in all her glory. But it's not just that great people can go out and do anything. It's that it's that great people may be people who are able to sense an opening in their times for something that hasn't been possible before. She could not have been what she was if she had been trying to do what she was trying to do, even 20 years before. I think it's important to see that the great people are really products of a lot of good luck, good support systems, a general willingness of a public consciousness to at least begin changing, something that some of her forebears were not privileged to experience. Okay, so she wasn't Joan of Arc and she wasn't the Lone Ranger, and I think those are both important insights that you bring to your work. I was thinking about this born early. What if she had been born earlier? What if she had come into her own in the time when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her friends in Seneca Falls were gathering for that first remarkable meeting which issued the Declaration of Sentiments. In that Declaration of Sentiments, these women talked, and a few men too, I have to say, were there, very clearly and bravely about how women were fundamentally excluded from all that men deemed worthwhile in terms of position, pursuit, etc. And that women in the home were still bound within the laws of coverture, which I'll explain in a bit, meaning that they were basically, by law, required to make their husband their head in all things, details to be provided. And under those circumstances, she couldn't have gotten where she was going. Other things had to happen first. Some of those other things she participated in. One of the important things that happened after the Declaration of Sentiments was that women began to get petitions and circulate and go to legislatures and knock on doors and get the basic idea of coverture overturned so that women could act as human beings in their own right before the law and in the public sphere. And it's partly because of that beginning of an undoing of the rule of coverture that there was a place for people like her to step into and to begin to press her right to profession, a right to her own earnings, a right to make her own decisions about her life, and a right to represent people in the public sphere, in this case, legal clients. Let me talk a little bit about coverture because I think it's an important backdrop that illustrates how extraordinary these early women were and why it was, what it was that had to be overcome. It's kind of here again, somewhat inspirational story if you leave out some of the nasty little things like some racism here and there and some other unfortunate developments. But nonetheless, when in Seneca Falls, the women had talked about women's second-class status this way. They listed the fact that women lacked the vote. Women had no voice in the formulation of laws. If they were married, they had no right to control property, their own property, which they had brought with them into marriage. Their husband could mortgage it, etc. Their personal property was his if he chose to claim it. In the eyes of the law, she was, as the Declaration said, civilly dead. She could not go to court in her own right. Her husband had to go as her representative. She if there was a question of death or divorce, not so easy to get in those days, and also not very favorable to women when they did become available. The guardianship of the children went to the husband automatically. There was the civil death idea included the idea not only that women couldn't enter into their own contracts, be their own business people if they were married, couldn't go to court representing themselves. It carried with it the sort of external problems which women like Belva Lockwood dramatically ran up against. Just the mere idea of being able to be a lawyer was problematic for women, because if you couldn't enter into contracts, how could you enter into a legal relationship and represent people? All right? So at the heart of all of this idea of coverture had robbed women of their agency to do what men did. Okay, so fast forward a bit and into the 70s, and we see in 1869 the first woman takes the exams and becomes a lawyer. 1869, that's the first one. And in the decade that follows, in the decade of the 70s, extraordinarily, the idea catches on. I know 75 lawyers doesn't sound like much today when 50% of the students in law schools are women, but in those days it was pretty good. And among them were women who were able to not only fight their own way into a position where they could be lawyers, but used the fact that they were lawyers to press forward on behalf of all women. So you have Belva Lockwood. So you have, for example, her sort of mirror image out in California. What was her name?
Clara Fultz.
Clara Shortridge Fultz, who found her biographer, just as Belva found hers in you, and Barbara Babcock of Stanford. She studied law. She became the first woman to actually be admitted to law practice. She felt a little embarrassed because she had studied law as an apprentice rather than going to law school. She decided she'd better go to law school. She then applies to law school, but within a few days she is told that women can't go to the law school she went to. At which point she works toward getting the law that would exclude her from law school eliminated. She is instrumental in getting a constitutional provision that says women can pursue any profession or avocation that they choose, and so on and so on. So there are great stories here, and they are stories about women going into law and deploying law on behalf of other women. So why didn't you call this Washington's Lady Lawyer? My footnote, just in my last point here, is you heard a few minutes ago from Justice Ruth Ginsburg, and working on the things that she experienced in her young life as somebody who decided to go to law school and met obstacles. She had a full scholarship to Harvard taken away from her because she got married and her husband was supposed to support her, and the money went to more worthy male candidates, to graduating from law school and finding that no major law firm would take her, even though she had transferred to Columbia and graduated first in her class. The justices of the Supreme Court were not interested in her. Justice Brandeis said he wasn't ready for a woman. Frankfurter said he wasn't ready for a woman yet. And yeah, I'm so glad I have a panel here working on this with me.
Well, Justice Brandeis was dead.
Yes, he was gone. If he had spoken from the grave, though, he might have said the same thing. There's that. There's that. So the story unfolds a great burst in this period that you talked about, and then a great burst in the early 70s. And Ruth Ginsburg, meeting obstacles, herself found her way into a position in law where she, too, could broaden the path and open doors for women. So, as you say, with your firsts there and your lasts, it still goes on. And I just want to thank you so much for the work you've done here. It's thrilling.
Thank you, Wendy.
Judge Ferren?
Thank you, Flip. Belva Lockwood is a compelling story, and Jill Norgren has made it read like a novel. It's beautifully written, and it's short. You don't have to wade through a lot of non-essential details. So get it, read it, and you'll be very glad that you did. To me, the book is particularly interesting for three reasons. First, it's about a woman who had an unusual variety of reforming interests and commitments, not just suffrage, but world peace, and a whole variety of things that you'll find interesting if you read this book. Secondly, Jill does a superb job of telling not only Belva Lockwood's story, but putting her in the larger context of women reformers who often worked together, and as she pointed out, sometimes fought together. So that's a story that you'll find worth following. And for me, though, what sets the book apart is the fact that Belva Lockwood had to work hard to make a living while she was taking on all of these causes. And, of course, it's the story of Belva Lockwood becoming a lawyer. Now, you've heard all about it. I have nothing more to say. But I was charged with summarizing in greater detail just how silly men were in trying to keep her out of the bar and out of the practice of law. So if there's some repetition, well, that goes with the territory, and I will give you some details you have not yet heard. You have heard that in 1869, when she was almost 39 years old, she sat in on some lectures at an institution I'd never heard about called Columbian College, which eventually became George Washington University, where they were starting some law courses. But they said, you can sit in, but we cannot grant you admission. And the letter that the president wrote to her when she demanded admission said, "Madam, after due consultation, the faculty have considered that such admission would not be expedient, as it would be likely to distract the attention of the young men." So, as you've heard a year later, National Law School, which also eventually merged into George Washington University, invited women to attend their law classes. And they could sit together in the same room for lectures, but their discussions were separated in other rooms. So perhaps for the same reason. But in any event, Lockwood completed the course, just as anybody had, and expected her diploma, and they said no. The faculty decided she had not studied long enough. Well, Lockwood knew that a diploma was not essential for admission to the bar in those days, so she arranged for an oral bar exam. Just couldn't take the written exam. They had to look at her in the face. And she passed. But the male practitioners of the day lobbied against her admission to the bar, and they did not do so. So she went to court. And the judge came upon a great solution. He ordered another bar exam. Nothing happened. So Lockwood said, well, I guess the only way to get admission would be to get a diploma. The District of Columbia had what they called a diploma privilege, that anyone who got a law school degree would automatically be admitted to the bar. I don't think there are too many of those these days, maybe in Wisconsin and a few other places. But in any event, she said, well, I'll try Georgetown. They didn't admit women, turned her down. She started attending lectures at Howard, where she was welcome. And then in 1873, she got her diploma, much delayed, from the National Law School, perhaps at the intervention of President Grant, perhaps because she was so obstinate in the letters that she wrote. In any event, she now was entitled to the bar of the District of Columbia. That didn't help. because each court had its own admission requirements. Well, she wanted to work in the Court of Claims, so she applied to the Court of Claims, and they turned her down because their rules said, we provide for the admission of men, and she wasn't one. So she turned around and came back to them not long after that, applied again, and they said no, because it's not that you're not a man, it's you're a married woman. And this is where this coverture comes into play, because under this doctrine, as Wendy pointed out, it said through marriage, husband and wife become one. That's biblical, right? And the man covered for the woman, which meant he controlled her, and she had no legal existence. And how can somebody who doesn't legally exist be admitted to the bar? Well, she came back a third time because the District of Columbia abolished the doctrine of coverture, and secondly, it passed a statute which said in all statutes where the reference is to the masculine gender, it also includes the feminine. She's home free. No, because this time the Court of Claims said, well, there's no express statute or rule admitting women, so we can't find you qualified, and she was turned down again. Well, then she decided to go to Congress, as you've heard, and she came up with a bill that she had friends sponsor that said no woman otherwise qualified shall be barred from practice before any U.S. court on account of sex or coverture. Had to cover that. And the bill made it to the House floor, and it didn't get any further. So Lockwood said, well, maybe I can get admitted to the Supreme Court, and everything else will flow. So she went to the Supreme Court, and as you heard, they turned her down for an extraordinary reason. Said the court does not feel called upon to make a change until such change is required by statute. Now, can you imagine today the Supreme Court saying, well, we can't adopt any rule unless Congress tells us it's all right? I mean, it's, that's how far they went to avoid the question. So she goes back to Congress, where her bill finally passed. It was signed by President Hayes in early 1879, about 10 years after she started the whole business, beginning her classes at Columbian College. Well, the next year, Belva Lockwood was the first woman to argue before the Supreme Court. And yet even the Supreme Court, 14 years later, got a case called In re Lockwood. She tried to get admitted in the state of, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and she was turned down. And the Supreme Court of the United States turned down her complaint because of states' rights. They took the position that it was not a privilege or immunity of a citizen of the United States protected by the 14th Amendment. So, in other words, the Virginia folks could discriminate against her. Well, as you can tell, Lockwood made a great start, and there was still a long way to go for equality for women, and I, too, attended a university that was totally lopsided with men, where all of those awful put-downs of women took place. But thank heavens we're at a place now where I think most of that is forgotten. So,
Not forgotten.
Over. Finished.
Well, it's either forgotten but not gone, or gone but not forgotten. In any event, read this book. You'll like it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, the floor is now open to all of you from the audience for your questions and comments. When you ask a question, will you be good enough to identify yourself and just wait for the microphone to be brought to you? Who would like to start us off? Susan, can you come over here? Linda is over here. And then we'll go to Kent.
Linda Greenhouse. I'll ask, actually all of you have alluded to the fact that this fabulous history of this great person was really lost for decades. And what's your theory? I mean, how could she have just sort of disappeared from public consciousness for such a long time?
Should I start?
Yeah.
Well, a niece by marriage did try and write her story, beginning actually in the period of World War I. She was an amateur. That didn't succeed. Her papers were destroyed. They were sent by her grandson at the time of her death to the Salvation Army to become pulp. And I think that was because at that time it simply wasn't within the culture to save papers in general, and I suspect the papers of women. This particular young man who was in his 20s didn't have much money, probably nowhere to store. She had a very large library of legal papers, but also she had a library, a peace library. She housed a branch of the International Peace Bureau in her home for many years. So there was a great deal. There was, of course, nothing like the Radcliffe Schlesinger Library, encouraging families either to keep papers themselves or pass them on. And then, you know, even though we had the modern woman and the jazz woman and Rosie the Riveter, we somehow lost our bearings, I think, in writing the history of 19th century women, perhaps in part because the archives weren't there. One of the slides that I didn't show today, but has interested me and addresses Linda's question, is that as late as 1958, a U.S. savings bond advertisement was appearing in American magazines using her picture, name, and accomplishments. I found one that appeared in 1958 in Holiday magazine. And I'm fascinated by that. So she was in somebody's zeitgeist. And during World War II, a merchant marine ship was named after her. But I think until we had that moment, both of women who were running bookstores, I'm thinking here of a very important woman in terms of women's history, Madeline Stern up in New York, who started writing about American women who had been lost in the 1950s, and then academic women like Gerda Lerner and others, that we just didn't have the writers with the resources and the knowledge to reclaim. So, and I think we've been fortunate both that our universities have helped to train us, our newspapers have, begun to cover women somewhat more systematically, even though sometimes, there has to be a little booting and kicking. And our granting agencies. I mean, I didn't say this, and I certainly should. Both my university, the Wilson Center, which I did mention, and the National Endowment for the Humanities supported this project. And I think it's one reason why men and women who write for the commercial press, who don't have big contracts, couldn't do this book.
I guess I'd add one other thing, too, and it has to do, again, with coverture in a sense. It is simply that the people writing history until, the 70s revolution were predominantly male, period. And we tend to notice most the people we identify with most. And honestly, the thing that is so remarkable about that early period is how much of that was lost and for how long it was lost. But beginning in the 70s and going forward, one of the projects for the women who were finally getting the PhDs and were finally becoming historians, and the women who were becoming lawyers in much larger numbers, was to go back and dig out those stories and start to tell them. So, and one of the people who does that most routinely, as Linda knows, is Ruth Ginsburg. I mean, she goes back and she finds out about somebody and she writes it up, and the next time somebody asks her to speak, that's what she presents. No matter what else is going on, that's what she does. She talks about the path markers, and she honors them, and she talks about them. And you and I both have joined in an enterprise of writing about these things because of our great interest in the half of the people that were left out of the major dominant histories during the period when we grew up.
I'd piggyback on Wendy's comment by saying that there is also the issue of the publishers, and it was one of the reasons why I wanted to single out my publisher. There is the sense, in particular with respect to figures from the 19th and early 20th century that they're just not going to sell their books. And I could list for you today a number of biographies that are sitting in desks because, and I've read some of them, and they're very credible, and they just can't find publishers. So that's an additional frustration.
Point.
Susan, thank you.
Jill, this is really great. We've been waiting for Belva for just a little while now.
And tell people who you are.
I'm Kent Hughes. I run a program here at the Wilson Center on Science, Technology, America, and the Global Economy, which includes women. We owed Jill a particular debt because some of you may remember the West Wing TV show. And the First Lady on the West Wing was going to go off and give a lecture on Belva Lockwood. And we all knew who she was, thanks to Jill. Well, I was curious about the daughter. You mentioned the daughter and how she kept things going and apparently did some publicity or something of that nature, but did she aspire to be a lawyer? What did she do with her life? Oh, she was.
Well, she did a year.
Of sorts.
Yeah. It's very interesting. And again, the lack of personal letters and diaries. Her daughter, Laura McNall, followed her mother really from about the age of 16 when she came back from sort of a women's seminary, and lived with her mother even after her marriage. Her family was there in this house on F Street with the extended family. And Laura is a shadowy figure to me. I like her enormously. I mean, she seems to try and emerge with her own identity, but doesn't. She writes a newspaper column that's quite sort of sassy. I think for regional markets, the place I was able to trace it was Lockport, New York, which is the biggest town near where her mother was born. But I have evidence that it also appeared perhaps in some Maryland newspapers. She writes that for on and off for almost 10 years, and I say in some of these articles she becomes her mother's naughty alter ego, because she'll, for example, talk about some members of Congress in rather biting ways that perhaps her mother might not have wanted to, although I don't think of Belva as being shy about much of anything. And she does attend the law school with her mother. I found one letter or something that indicated that for a year, but then stops. And becomes really, I think, an office manager, and again, sort of out of an apprenticeship, becomes an attorney in the firm. Her mother was very specific. When she was interviewed by the great daredevil reporter Nellie Bly, Belva said that she practiced with her daughter Laura. But Laura, for those of you who've ever used Washington, D.C.'s Boyd's directory, have any of you used it for any reasons? Laura, you give your name and your address and your profession. And Laura never claimed herself as an attorney. So I can't explain that. I don't know whether her mother, wanted to make it all a bit more grand and wanted to make her daughter more grand. But she is a very interesting figure, and she takes ill when she's 44 and dies within a couple of weeks. So she dies in 1894. Her husband lives for another 7 years, and then in 1901, 70 or 71-year-old Belva Lockwood becomes the primary guardian of an 11-year-old boy, and it's the grandson who destroys her papers, ultimately.
Other questions? Cassie, over here, please.
My name's Sheridan Harvey. I like to go to the Congressional Cemetery sometimes because I live on Capitol Hill, and it's always a real challenge to find her grave. So if you could get it, a better stone or something so we can find it. And why is she there?
Thank you, all of your work up at the Library of Congress, the wonderful book that you put together. on women. I assume she's there because that's where her grandson put her, but also because, in fact, those who preceded her, her daughter had a little girl, Inez, who died when she was about 4 or 5, and had another child who probably died immediately or very shortly after birth. So those 2 children were there as well. And when my husband and I first learned that she was there and went looking for her, we were certainly very taken at how far away from anything it was. And one of the stones is actually in error. I believe that it describes her daughter's first child as an aunt, when it's actually a unless there happened to, and I've never come across a person who was an aunt. So some of you may know that the Congressional Cemetery is having a 100th birthday celebration. Is Patrick here? I don't know if he's around the weekend of May 19th. And so some other authors and I will be there talking about some of the folk who are in the cemetery.
Thanks. Other questions? Well, then I want to pose one to the panelists because, Linda, thank you for raising the whole question of why is there not more women's history? And I really would like the panelists to address the question of what will happen to women's history in the near future, 19th century women's history, not the internet generation, whatever. Because I've been thinking about your question since you posed it and remembering that when I started in academia, before the 1970s revolution, well, first of all, there weren't any women's studies departments. And as Wendy quite correctly said, the historians were men, and they really didn't think that women were worth studying precisely because women had not had a sufficient public face. And what was history and biography then? It was all the public sphere. So that I know one of the questions that Jill has confronted constantly as she's put this book together and has written the book is, but can't you give us more of the human being here, which is not something you would have heard about men's biographies back then. They didn't want the human being, they wanted all the great public accomplishments. And because there were not the great public accomplishments because of coverture and things of this kind, papers were not kept and so on. And I know that Jill, in working on this biography, opened files, old case files of Belva Lockwoods that apparently had not been opened since they were first put into
at the National Archives.
At the archives, you know. To what extent will we be able to reclaim, do you think, the history of women in the 19th century and perhaps the early 20th century, not to mention times much before that? Do you have any thoughts about that? Women's History Month being a particularly good time to ask this question.
Well, let me say a few things, and then maybe we could also hear from people from the Women's Museum, because I'm interested, for example, in what the role of the Internet will be in expanding our understanding of history in general, and of course the history of women. I sometimes wonder whether some of this is women's history is burdened by language. I mean, I always wonder if I use a vocabulary, let's say, talking about Lockwood, of her being part of a pro-democracy movement, whether that would shift interest and audience, particularly as the United States, for example, has been involved in attempting to get governments abroad interested and willing in letting women into their governments. So I don't know whether we're burdened by the way that we talk about it. I think the very practical problems that I spoke about before, whether our granting agencies, whether our publishers will support this kind of work, is going to have a lot to do with what happens. Whether you're a young professor looking for promotion or whether you're a writer who needs to pay her rent. Ultimately, it becomes very difficult to do work, and we know that biography in general is simply not something that you do quickly. There's just too much sleuthing. You know, you either have, like Dr. Strum, you either have hundreds of thousands of documents, which she encountered in her biography of Justice Brandeis, or you have, you know, my looking under every pebble, forget rock, every pebble for things. It's just very time consuming. So I think those are issues, and I'd be curious to hear from you about what I'm very seriously thinking about as I contemplate my next book, which will probably be a woman's biography, is really whether to stay with these forms or whether to look to the internet, which of course involves your having some, you know, nice university that'll let you put stuff up on their server. But could we hear a little bit your vision?
Yes, thank you. One of the things that characterize your research is the need to access public records like the archives, and the court records was what was kept, so probably took too much energy to sort through and throw out the women's papers. So that's why we have that come down to us. But one of the things I think is a core organizational principle of our museum effort is to reach out to women's organizations, because many times women, through voluntary societies, came together, organized themselves, and many of these organizations still have records of their activities. You didn't mention it, but I think it's my understanding that Belva Lockwood was a founder of the Women's Bar Association of the District of Columbia. So that might serve as a kind of a source for obtaining the records that the public gatekeepers of information would not have deemed very important.
What do you think about the internet or electronic?
It certainly offers people an opportunity to put a lot of information out there, but it's really not vetted. So one really doesn't know whether you're getting good, solid information. As a museum, one of the projects we're about to unveil, we hope, is one that would enable women to go online and create a registry of their own accomplishments, or somebody in their family or acquaintance that they want to honor. Yeah. And so we are taking account of the fact that may be a very good way of collecting data on women today that we might lose in the future. But again, we're quite conscious, and an academic would remind us that it's not being vetted. Nobody is really going in and determining whether information that someone posts is in fact accurate information. But certainly you'd get a breadth of experience and input that would be lacking without that medium.
Right. We have a few that are vetted. I mean, the women's social movement that Kitty Sklar and others have pulled together is peer-reviewed. But you're right. I mean, we have the Wikipedia problem, right?
So we need a lot of you to go out there with tape recorders and things of that kind and get us good information. There's a question over here. Acacia?
Ann Stone, also with the National Women's History Museum. A couple things. One, is her house still standing?
No.
Yeah, I figured not, but I thought I'd ask. National Trust didn't save that one. And two, to dovetail with Susan's point about the Internet, you're right, Susan. Obviously, a lot of the Internet is not vetted, but our site is. And we have historians that look at the stuff before it goes up, and we're very careful about what we put up. So certainly that should be a home that you could feel you could bring additional information for us to post. And it's always been part of the sort of 5-point program of the museum that when we finally get Congress to give us our site, which we are going to pay for, so they just give us the vacant building, and we get our full endowment put together, one of the goals has always been to have money available for research, knowing that much of women's history is still not known. So certainly in the future, and anybody here that wants to write their check out to the National Women's History Museum Endowment Fund, you'll put us that much closer. But in building that endowment, that is one of the goals in the future. But certainly, again, our site should be a home that you could feel that you could, bring information to.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I think that this is as good a time as... Oh, one more. I'm sorry. Sir, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Patrick Crowley from Congressional Cemetery. I was up in the overflow room upstairs.
Okay. I mentioned it, Patrick.
and it's our bicentennial on May 19th.
Sorry.
And I'm really looking forward to have you there. You were mentioning you might be writing another book, or you probably will be. It's your passion. I'd like to recommend Anne Royal, who's also at Congressional Cemetery, a fascinating journalist who, similar story, was married a wealthy man. When he died, his family came in and took everything from her and left her penniless, and she turned to writing to survive and support her child.
Do you know her dates?
Not offhand, but you have tons of records over there.
That's interesting because the person that I'm thinking about writing is also a journalist and publisher, Miriam Leslie. Do you know the Frank Leslie's Illustrated from the 19th century? And it's also an interesting, though I think quite a different story in the sense that more of a sort of Catherine Graham story. But I mean, maybe we need a book about women journalists of that moment. It's a great idea. Thank you.
I'd just like to throw out a couple of pieces of trivia. First, there is a statue, small one, of Belva Lockwood on just outside the elevator on the inside of the clerk's office of the Federal District Court. It was presented by the Women's Bar Association, I forget the year, but it might be nice if somebody could arrange to have it in the public area. The other thing is, just a couple comments about women at the bar generally in the United States, and I'm sure you all can correct me if I have the facts wrong here, but I think the first woman lawyer in the United States actually came from England. Her name was Margaret Brent, and I think she was in Maryland. I think it was 1638 or something like that. And then it wasn't really until like 1869 or something like that when Washington University in St. Louis was one of the first, if not the first, universities, at least that I'm aware of, that admitted women to their law school. And there were two who became members of the bar. One graduated, the other didn't. Also the State University of Iowa, or its predecessor. So the Midwest, true to its fine tradition, was at the forefront of some of this. The first woman admitted to the bar in the District of Columbia was Charlotte Ray, who preceded Lockwood, who was the second one, I believe, and Charlotte Ray was a graduate of Howard. So there's...
Charlotte Ray's an interesting case because she signed her name C. Ray, and they didn't really think.
Carl?
Well,
it's not clear that they knew she was a woman.
I'm just looking. Professor J. Clay Smith
Yes.
at Howard insists they did know she was a woman.
Well, he was the first one who said they might not.
Ah, all right.
I guess he's progressed since I spoke with him.
Charlotte Ray is, again, someone who we should certainly be writing more about and cannot because there are so few papers about her. She came from an illustrious African-American family. Her father was a very well-known minister. I think Professor Smith described him once to me as the Jesse Jackson of his day. And she went to Howard and was admitted to the D.C. bar on the motion of her entire class, and one could see the page with the entries at the National Archives. I have found at least one entry in the docket books with her name, so we know she did make an effort early on to practice. And whether the combination of sex and race defeated her, or whether she decided in the end that she didn't wish to practice law, we have no record on this, but she does apparently turn to teaching and at some point moves to New York, perhaps to Brooklyn. And we lose a lot of her trail. She and her sister write a little book, which I think is up in the Schomburg Library at City College in New York, about their dad. But that seems to be about all we know of her.
We could try out one other tiny factoid, which is in D.C., a couple women started what's now American University Law School, and they did it because they were tutoring young women who couldn't, get into law school. So they were going to start one of their own. And there's been some interesting work done on that by Mary Clark, who's a professor at AU. So, all of these things that happened just never made it to the surface until people started looking. Back to the computer thing, just one thought there. There are some the computer's a wonderful thing. There's some classes now that post the student papers on various topics. Barbara Babcock, for example,
Right.
has a wonderful
Has a
website.
wonderful website.
And here at Georgetown, Richard Chusett runs a similar
Uh-huh.
website. So that one thing to do is check university websites and see if some faculty member is producing that kind of material, putting their student material
Right.
up as well.
I'm
Well,
glad you
I'm
mentioned that, because Barbara Babcock has used her Women in Law seminar at Stanford Law School to have students, as their term project, explore a woman connected in some way with law. And one of the things that I think is really superb about the project is not that we get at the end of this a 20 to 40 or 50-page paper from each of these students, but because they're at Stanford and they have access to an absolutely superb library and library staff, these young men and women in Professor Babcock's class have just churned up, is the only word for it, incredible original documents. It's been an extraordinary. Thank you for bringing that up.
Well, I think the bottom line is that there are a lot of stories out there still to be told. And so I would like very much to thank Jill Norgren for having brought one of those to light so that we can benefit from that. Will you join us after this session in a little wine and cheese reception outside, at which you're more than welcome to mingle with all of us? But before you do that, will you please join me in thanking our three panelists today?